China's always insisted that it will do anything to avoid chaos. It shot a large number of its own people in Beijing 30 years ago to do that. But it's failed comprehensively to address the protests in Hong Kong. Why?
Maintaining stability has always been a pillar for China's development since the late 1970s.
But it's failed to do it in Hong Kong.
Well, Hong Kong is different ever since 1997.
We're told it's part of China now.
China has practiced one country, two systems. So in Hong Kong, the primary responsibility of maintaining law and order is resting on the shoulders of the Hong Kong ACR government and the chief executive Carrie Lam.
The Hong Kong government, that's approved by Beijing.
Absolutely. Hong Kong is part of China and under the one country, two system.
So it's doing Beijing's business. It's not doing it very well, is it? It's failed. It's failed to keep the hated extradition law, didn't it? It was forced to withdraw that. It tried threats, calling the demonstrators rampant and deranged and warning that a blow from the sword of law was waiting for them in the future.
I would say the primary situation right now is law enforcement. You are talking about restoration of law and order in Hong Kong. And democracy, of course, when the British left Hong Kong in 1997, they did not leave behind a lot of democracy to talk about. But the British did leave behind deeply entrenched rule of law tradition. And I think we all need to be very grateful for that. And it is now law and order very much at stake in Hong Kong. We should not be confused with many other grievances and political pursuits in Hong Kong. They are important and they need to be dealt with, but law and order is the primary responsibility of the Hong Kong ACR government right now.
The point is that this was the largest pro-Beijing party which was forced to declare defeat. For this major defeat, we said, we do not want to find any excuses and reasons. This was Starry Lee, chair of the largest pro-Beijing party. This is a big blow to China's prestige, isn't it?
No, my reading is very different. Hong Kong is a democracy, and there is universal suffrage in Hong Kong for the people in Hong Kong for the district council elections. Therefore, the fact that the election results are such speak loudly for the fact that Hong Kong has democratic rights. People can vote whatever they want to do.
Well, the results speak for themselves.
Because none of the persons running for the district council had any courage to stand out for violence. They stood for legal and lawful means of exercising their democratic rights. I think that counts. So long as democratic rights are exercised peacefully and lawfully, everyone is a winner. No one is a loser. What we need to oppose in Hong Kong is violence. That is the key.
You ignore the fact that China's plan has been to chip away at Hong Kong's freedoms and democracy until they were all meaningless, and then Beijing could reassert full control. That's been the plan, hasn't it? All along.
Again, with due respect, I disagree.
Why? Like the kidnapping of 5 Hong Kong booksellers who just happened to turn up in mainland China, the crackdown on those who led the 2014 process, the highly controversial decision to allow mainland Chinese police to operate in the West Kowloon station. All this is chipping away at the freedoms of Hong Kong. Did Beijing imagine that people wouldn't notice this?
I think we need to really keep an eye on the big picture. That is, ever since 1997, Hong Kong has managed to keep its relative independence, judiciary independence, for example, political system, there has been no change.
Let's deal with universal suffrage, because that's been most controversial. The refusal of the Hong Kong government to move towards universal suffrage for the chief executive position, as outlined in the Basic Law. Even after the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress in Beijing ruled that 2017 could see the start of universal suffrage for this position, the date came and went, so the promise hasn't happened, has it? And perhaps Beijing never intended that the promise should be fulfilled.
I think we need to be clear as to what we are talking about. Universal suffrage, no problem with that. You already have universal suffrage for the district council election in Hong Kong, as we witnessed.
Which you say doesn't amount to very much.
No, it's meaningful. It's very important.
But you don't have it for the chief executive, despite the fact that it's promised. It's in the Basic Law.
Then again, allow me to mention, you are talking about universal suffrage or direct election of the chief executive.
Exactly.
Yeah. Does the United Kingdom have direct election for the Prime Minister? No.
We're talking about what's in the basic law for Hong Kong, Victor Gao. We're not talking about what things are like in Britain or in America or on Mars. You can play the whatabout game indefinitely. I'm talking about Hong Kong. What it said was, in the basic law, the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. And that didn't happen, did it?
These questions are everywhere for everyone to see. The universal suffrage is not a problem. Direct election that the protesters are now demanding is a problem, because why do you want to give Hong Kong something that neither the United States nor the United Kingdom have had for hundreds of years?
Because this is what they see that they were promised.
Remember when Deng Xiaoping was still alive and he was the key architect for the one country, two system, he said, for the record, that if the one country, two system will work out for the first 50 years, why couldn't it be extended for another 50 years? So there is an uncertainty as to what will happen in Hong Kong after 2047. I would say everything will come to an end if, for example, violence continues in Hong Kong. However, if stability, prosperity, development, and the improvement of the people's living standards are the normal things all the way leading up to 2047, why couldn't the one country, two system apply for more years?
It's no good asking me. You have to talk to the Beijing's leadership. But if things don't go to Beijing's liking, and I'm sure they're not too pleased about the protests and the demands for freedom and the demands for China to live up to its promises and its international obligations, do you think that people are going to accept life in China, a crushing level of censorship, what the UN High Commission for Human Rights recently called a context of increasing limitation on fundamental rights in China? You think people in Hong Kong will ever accept that?
Allow me to mention one point. Putting Hong Kong in the overall magnitude and the scale of China, whatever bad things that have happened in Hong Kong over the past 6 months,
I'm talking about bad things in China.
Is at the best can be called a storm in a teacup. It's not going to change meaningfully anything that's happening in People's Republic of China at all. What Beijing is unhappy about and adamantly is opposed to is the violence in Hong Kong.
My point is, though, that if China fully takes over control of Hong Kong in 2047 and thinks so little of human rights as the UN says it does, do you really expect the people of Hong Kong to embrace the kind of life you have in China? I mean, the legal obligations and commitments, the multiple laws, decrees and policies, in particular those concerning national security and terrorism, which the UN says deeply erode the foundations for the viable social, economic and political development of society. You think after having the freedoms that they have in Hong Kong, they're going to accept that kind of life from China?
China is in firm control of the situation in Hong Kong as far as sovereignty is concerned. No one in the world can really second guess this point or really take Hong Kong away from China.
I'm not answering the question I asked, which is whether Beijing imagines Hong Kong would ever accept the kind of restrictions that Beijing imposes on its own people on the mainland.
After 2047, China has full discretion to decide what kind of political system will prevail in Hong Kong.
What would the people of Hong Kong get in return for being subsumed into China? A chance to be spied on by what Human Rights Watch called one of the world's most intrusive mass surveillance systems?
Whatever happens will happen in Hong Kong after 2047. Therefore,
China's record of arbitrary detention, torture and violations of right to a fair trial.
Let's look at how China is developing. Let's look at China lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Let's look at how Hong Kong has benefited tremendously over the past 22 years after being part of the one country, two system, after China re-exercised its sovereignty over Hong Kong.
Let's talk about
this
censorship.
is the negative.
Let's talk about censorship, Mr. Gao. In an interview earlier in the year, you called it unfortunate censorship in China. You said hopefully, eventually, there will be less censorship. leading towards no censorship at all. And I hope there'll be a day when people in China can freely watch foreign broadcasters. That's a pretty forlorn hope, isn't it, when you consider that 400 million extra CCTV cameras are going online and the unprecedented degree of intrusion by the state into people's lives that we're seeing. Things are not moving in the direction you hoped for, are they?
What you quoted was my view earlier this year. It is still my view today. And I think it will remain my view for the rest of my life.
But it's a forlorn hope, isn't it? Things are not going this way.
No, lesser censorship may be good. However, every society has its own sensitive issues to censor about. Look at the United States. They censor a lot of things that the people here in Britain do not care about. In Britain, you censor other things. In Israel, they censor other things.
Here we go. You're talking about all the other countries.
Society.
Let's just stay with China. You admitted this. You said the monitoring of social behavior of people in China does exist. There are quite a few aspects of that which I personally do not like.
Yeah.
Is the detention of around 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang one of the aspects that you don't personally like?
I visited Xinjiang many times. I have many Uyghur friends, Islamic friends in China.
I didn't ask you that.
I deal with them as brothers and sisters. I think to really ask responsible questions about Xinjiang, we need to know the spread of terrorism and separatism and extremism in Xinjiang.
There hasn't been any terrorism in Xinjiang for the last 4 years.
Why? Because what the government
because
did.
you've locked up people without rights and without recourse and without any redress and without the ability to challenge their own incarceration. You think that's a good way of doing things? We're talking about the detention in so-called training centres, which were first denied and then finally admitted by Beijing last year. The UN says people were sent there under the guise of counter-terrorism and de-extremism policies, which you've just mentioned, and amid extensive limitations on the exercise of fundamental rights in Xinjiang. Are you proud of that?
Let me make a point. Terrorism just do not come out of the vacuum. Terrorism is the result of a process, and the process is very much dominated by indoctrination and extremism, for example. In Xinjiang, there is no denying there is an increasing level of radicalization. Many families actually deny their kids the right to education, which in China is considered as an offense or a crime. No one in China has any right to deprive their kids the right to go to school.
Mr. Gao, the UN is expressing concerns about increasing practices of arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, absence of judicial oversight, and restrictions on the right to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Quite a list, isn't it? Quite a list. Also the right to freedom of assembly and movement within what it calls an increasingly securitized environment. This is a catalogue of rights to which your government has formally signed up in binding international treaties and which it is now violating wholesale. And I'm asking you whether you're proud of all that.
2 points. First of all, the United Nations, generally speaking, is in line with what China has been doing over the past 4 decades or so.
It's not in line with the treatment in Xinjiang, as you well know.
More than 50 countries in the world support what the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang in dealing with terrorism, extremism,
More than 50
and
of
the
your
separatism.
client states who are hardly beacons of human rights.
Many of which are Muslim countries.
Let's be honest about
Many
this.
of these countries are Islamic
And many
countries,
of them are
Muslim
your client
countries.
states. You're proud that the UN
China
had to
has no
remind
client
you.
state at all in the world.
No, really.